All right. Thank you. And generals, fellow flight surgeons, and distinguished colleagues, I'm pleased to stand here for Richard Scheuring and present this. Dr. Scheuring is an Army Reserve flight surgeon, but in his civilian job, he is also a NASA flight surgeon. And I can speak to this subject with some authority, as I had a similar career path for about 10 years when I was also a NASA flight surgeon. So next slide. So like the previous speaker, Dr. Scheuring is thankful to me for inviting him to give this presentation, and also to Dr. Cookwell, and he acknowledges his other colleagues there at the Johnson Space Center. Next slide. So today will not be a soup to nuts disposition about space medicine. I think the main point is to look at several of the things that are common issues with the NASA astronauts and see how they impact the particular things about NASA space missions. As I was sitting in the audience listening to many of our presentations, I'm struck that several of these topics have been covered fairly well already, not only by Dr. Bendrick, Brian Smith, Major Filatov, and Dr. Dahman related to the space missions, but Master Sergeant King talking about the work-rest cycle, Colonel Pippig talking about orthopedics. All of these things are just as common to our challenges with spaceflight. Next slide. So I'll be speaking both about short duration flights, which we think of on the shuttle mission, maybe 10 to 14 days, and long duration flights, which we have experienced now on the International Space Station. Previous to that, the United States had a joint program with the Russians, such that we sent 7 astronauts to work with the Russians and go up to the Mir space station. Of course, the Russians have a very long history of long duration missions in space, but we see changes across the gamut of our physiologic systems. Today, I think we'll talk on the top 4, but in any of them, especially the last one, you could have an expert come here and talk to you for about an hour at least on the intricacies of these changes. Next slide. So, space motion sickness. This is not what you want to have happen, that your whole crew is barfing and therefore distracted from their work and distracted from what they need to do in the mission. I'm sure these guys were just posing for the picture. Next slide. And you might have to hit it twice to go to the next slide. There we go. So space motion sickness is, as all of you know, is a particularly big problem. And it can be mild. It can just be loss of appetite, and it's over in a couple of hours. But we have had cases where, no kidding, an astronaut was almost debilitated because of nausea and vomiting for a couple of days. And it begins, for some people, immediately. MECO is main engine cutoff. That's as the shuttle goes up, and then the main engines burn out and they insert into orbit. So from that moment, you might start to have these symptoms. And as we saw from the previous talk about sea-related motion sickness, it might go 48 or 72 hours before it would resolve naturally. Next slide. And again, one more time. So that crew there is the second International Space Station crew. I was their flight surgeon. That is Yuri Usachev and Susan Helms. So there's a lot of theories about what causes space motion sickness. Some thought it was just, regular motion sickness, just in a different environment. They thought that, well, it's due to proprioceptive mismatches. It's due to the visual proprioceptive mismatches. The newest theory, I think, has to do with the idea that otoliths have asymmetric mass, and we're normally adapted to that over time, but with zero gravity and the fluid shift, maybe some changes in the semicircular canals, that this causes changes in otolith function as well. Next slide. Again, we've seen this, and our Russian colleagues have seen this, and the symptoms can definitely have an operational impact if you don't take some sort of action. Next slide. So, I was struck listening to, I think Mr. Smith, Brian Smith, the other day, talking about the devices that NASA is using at Ames to help investigate this, and I thought, gosh, we were doing the same thing at the Johnson Space Center, and I wonder if we ever got together on that. So we also had a room which had a rotating visual field. We also had another room that had a device where the astronaut would sit on it, and the device would tilt one way, but the astronaut would translate along a rail the other way. So they've tried several ways to identify the basic science mechanism and to figure out some countermeasures. But unhappily, I'm not happy to say that they never could quite figure it out. They never could allow for an astronaut to be adapted to that pre-flight. And they never could come up with a formula that said, aha, this will predict when a certain astronaut is going to be susceptible to space motion sickness. Just wasn't correlated at all. So operationally, we settled on just using promethazine. So a little story about this and the science behind this. Maybe some of you know Dr. Richard Jennings, who used to be with NASA. He was recently president of asthma. So when I started at NASA, he was the chief of flight medicine, and he told a story about this. And I think I asked him, hey, if promethazine works so well, why do we continue doing these research studies? I mean, we're spending millions of dollars on this. And he said, well, it gets back to this. If one of these days that the center director has to come through and bring a congressman or a senator, they want to see that you're employing their millions of dollars to good effect. So if you take them into a room with all this great equipment and you talk about space motion sickness and all the work you're doing to mitigate it and show all the people working, that's very impressive. But if you just go to the cabinet, the medicine cabinet, and pull out a vial of Phenergan, you know, that's kind of disappointing. They don't think they're getting their money's worth. So there's some political realities to, you know, research versus operational solutions. But we found that promethazine works great. We typically would administer that to the astronaut right at the end of the crew day, in which they can go right to sleep and have a good night's sleep and then get started the next morning with a very busy schedule. Next slide. Fluid shift. This is another big issue that is common to all the astronauts. And, you know, as I stand here today, I have a significant volume of my fluid in my lower torso and in my legs, as we all do. And we have the venous pump with walking and moving that gets that fluid back up into our central circulation, but that all goes away under conditions of spaceflight. So the impact then is that you have a reduction in plasma volume, red cell mass, and reduction in cardiac output. Next slide. And one more slide. So in fact, this actually begins for our astronauts when they're sitting on the pad, because they may be in that position with their back down and their feet up for 3 or 4 hours before the launch begins. So this starts right away. Next slide. This is a slide that builds. If you'll hit this the first time, you'll see figure A is you and I standing on the ground, and we have a lot of that fluid reserve in the lower extremities. Go ahead and hit the slide one time. And then hit it the second time. Figure B then is when you immediately get into the zero gravity environment and you have this cephalad shift of the fluid. And to your receptors, it appears as if all of a sudden you have some fluid overload. Next slide. And then your body adapts, as it does in all the other systems, to have a new normal for spaceflight. Next slide. And then, of course, when we return to Earth, then this is dysfunctional, it's maladaptive, and we have symptoms of kind of a relative hypovolemia at this point. So operationally, what we do for that is that we have the astronauts actually fluid load with salt tablets and water within a couple of hours of the deorbit. Next slide. That is Dr. Scheuring there on the left, and he's with Senator John Glenn. So some people have called this the puffy head bird leg syndrome. You can see Senator Glenn on the bottom picture, STS 95, and you can kind of get a sense that his face is a little puffy. And if you've seen pictures of astronauts like this, you'll see this as an example many, many times. Next slide. So physical performance, this is a big issue with our astronauts because they, as others have mentioned to some extent, they are athletes and they are industrial workers, and especially when they do spacewalks, extravehicular activities, they really have a need for strength and endurance. So we pay attention pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight to their physical fitness. We do many different ways of functional fitness testing, and we have a whole team of trainers and therapists to help them keep and maintain good fitness. Go ahead. Next slide. So Dr. Scheuring had about 10 slides in of this sort of thing, and I cut them down to 2 or 3. But the bottom line here is where we have measured their aerobic capacity or their strength. Here you see for long duration flyers, they're reduced in their aerobic capacity until about 30 days. R plus 30 is return plus 30 days after they've gone through a rigorous rehab protocol. They get back up to their baseline with aerobic fitness. Next slide. And I think in this slide and the next one you'll see something similar with their strength and their endurance with their hamstring muscle. Again, taking up to 30 days before they get back to kind of a baseline normal. Next slide. Same thing here. Next slide. So there are some other things that you may not expect that also kind of are bothersome annoyances sometimes to our astronauts, and one of those is back pain. Again, and this begins to happen right when they enter into orbit because there's no compressive forces on the spinal column. So probably half of our astronauts experience this back pain. Not only is it painful, but it's bothersome and annoying. They tend to not want to move because anything they do will exacerbate it. Go ahead, next slide. And you might have to hit that twice. Next slide. I hope it goes to the next slide. There we go. So we see changes up to about 6 centimeters with that. There's some vertebral end plate changes, or there may be some disc changes, maybe some swelling in the disc or some engorgement. So when the soft tissues get stretched, they become irritated and inflamed. So we do some stretching exercises, some repositioning, and some anti-inflammatories, and that generally will resolve itself. The Russians have an interesting device that they call the penguin suit. And the penguin suit is it's a very tight elastic band suit, and you put it on and you pull the tension on the elastic bands, and that does give them relief on their back, but for the rest of their movements it's very constricting. So at least our astronauts didn't like to wear that so well, but it is an approach to deal with this problem. Next slide. And beyond that, you have some tendinitis, tendinosis, and several other joints. And within our astronaut population, we have seen a propensity toward herniated nucleus pulposus later on in their careers. That may perhaps have a causal relationship to the changes we see from spaceflight. Next slide. All right, so what is the operational impact? Well, if you're the pilot and you have these issues with cardiovascular deconditioning or the fluid loss, and you have some back pain, or you have space motion sickness, these things might affect your proficiency bringing the vehicle back in. Next slide. It could also, decrease your ability to perform an emergency egress, whether it would be from the shuttle or whether it be from the Soyuz, which is our vehicle to and from the space station now. Next slide. And more importantly, you know, if you're not in good musculoskeletal shape, it might interfere with your ability to perform work, which would be the extravehicular activities or the spacewalks. Go ahead. So, how do we maintain fitness in space? And I mentioned before that we pay a lot of attention to this. So we have three pretty good devices on the space station. One is a treadmill, the other is a bicycle ergometer, the third is a resistive exercise device, so you can kind of get the feeling of lifting weights in space. You'll notice that the acronym for the treadmill is TVIS, and the VIS part stands for Vibration Isolation System. So again, another nuance of humans being in a system. If you're running on a treadmill and banging away, you don't want all of those vibrations going throughout the space station and affecting other instrumentation. Go ahead, next slide. So we place a lot of emphasis. We have on their normal schedule twice a day where they should exercise. I wish my normal schedule had twice a day where I could get over to the gym. And they'll typically do at least 2 of these types of exercises per day. And then about once a month, we'll actually do a physical fitness assessment and see where are they compared to their pre-flight baseline with their resistive strength or their aerobic capacity. I will tell you, though, that this is one of the first things that gets dropped. And we'll talk a little bit later about their work-rest cycle and fatigue. But when they're busy with a full slate of tasks to do, whether it's science or station maintenance, it's easy to just say, well, I'm not going to do this and I'll catch up later. That can come back to hurt them if those choices persist or that situation persists for weeks and weeks. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, why do we need this? Because we want them to be at peak performance for any of these critical mission tasks, and it helps greatly when they return to Earth and they start their rehab to get back to normal. Pardon me, I've had a cold this week. Next slide. This is our relatively new astronaut gym, and so like I said, we put a lot of resources into their physical fitness. When they come back from space, we have about a 6-week formal rehabilitation plan for them, the first 3 weeks of which are very tightly controlled. You know, they don't get pulled out for other duties and things. Probably one of the good influences that the flight surgeon community has had is to protect that time very well. But when they get back, they start out with simple things, just stretching, just range of motion exercises, and gradually they'll do more and more rigorous things, focusing on balance, proprioception, and mobilization, and eventually get back to lifting weights, core exercises, jumping, getting their reaction time back, etc. Next slide. I want to diverge a little bit more into the EVA fitness program. Just like for humans in an aircraft, if you think of the spacesuit that we have, that's their own little spacecraft. And there are some anthropomorphic issues with that spacecraft. In the U.S. EVA suit, for example, the upper torso is rigid, and their arms go in, and their arms and their shoulders are at such a position that they have limited mobility, and we have had a long history of astronauts with shoulder problems, impingement syndromes, etc. So pre-flight and in-flight, we place a great amount of emphasis for those crew members to have very good upper body strength from the shoulders right down to the grip. The Russian suit is a little bit different. It actually feels better to the astronaut, but the pressure within the Russian suit is higher than that of the U.S. suit. I think it's maybe 5.6 psi. which has advantages for things like preventing decompression sickness, but that suit in itself has more resistance to work again. So it's probably have to overcome with selecting good crew, and then they have to be trained and continue to stay in good shape. Go ahead, next slide. I think this just goes through all of the various types of exercises they use to target the specific muscles of the upper extremities. Next slide. So now I don't know if you'll see what's unusual about this picture. I'd love to say that this astronaut did this because he or she was fatigued, but I can't say that with a straight face. Does anyone see anything unusual about that astronaut in there? It's very subtle. If you look at his boots, he's got his boots on the wrong feet. So I know some of us do that when we're fatigued after a late night, early morning. But go ahead, next slide. So sleep, just as in other shift workers and other industries, sleep is a big issue with our astronauts. And it's not just at the beginning of the mission. I'm telling you, these people are busy, 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 going through a very rigorous training cycle for, a year before the launch. So, but it goes without saying how important sleep is. But even mission time, day in and day out, they'll skimp on their sleep. I said the first thing to go when they were very busy was exercise. Then the second thing to go is sleep, because from the astronaut's perspective, if he's not accomplishing the mission and all the daily tasks that are there, then he or she is not succeeding. So they're going to get her done no matter what. Go ahead, next slide. So a lot of factors that contribute to reduced sleep. I would just look at the second bullet point, and that is the workload and scheduling. I place the blame of a lot of that on us in the ground control, because there's 100 things for them to do, and when you're a mission planner and everything kind of fits on your paper from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you think, oh, no problem, then you send that up to the crew, and as I mentioned a minute ago, by golly, the crew is going to get that work done. So, it's been a real struggle, because the flight surgeon often has to take up the banner of, crew rest. But it's one of those fights we continue to fight, mission in and mission out. Go ahead, next slide. The body clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, drives our circadian rhythm. Next slide. And we know that is set by light. Well, when you're going around the planet at 17,500 miles an hour, you have sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes. So that that light cycle is taken away from your circadian rhythm. Go ahead, next slide. So there are some countermeasures. We can be deliberate when we create our schedules. If we have to do a sleep shift, we can do those things gradually, etc. Here's a difference between the U.S. program and the Russian program, for example. The U.S. program prefers to do a gradual sleep shift, and we have a lot of experience with that in our shuttle crews, especially pre-launch, where we'll shift them an hour per day for 5 or 6 days, depending on the mission constraints. The Russians prefer just to do, I call it the slam shift. If they've got to stay up 5 or 6 hours to do a progress redocking, they would just rather do it all in one fell swoop and get it done. So sometimes we do it the gradual way, sometimes we do it the Russian way. That's always up for negotiation between the mission control centers. Next slide. We do use some countermeasures. We do use melatonin. We do use some of the other sleep pharmacologic aids. Next slide. And we are now looking at some light protocols. Certainly in the pre-flight phase for the shuttle missions, we used light therapy extensively when we were doing the circadian shifting for them. We know that light at the blue end of the spectrum, which corresponds to new dawns and daylights, are stimulatory. Light at the red end of the spectrum doesn't have that same effect. Next slide. And next slide. So we see that happens to correspond to the sunrise and sunset. And what NASA is looking at now, as the replacement lights come up for the space station, they're going to put some that they could turn on that would be at the blue end of the spectrum, and some that they could turn on at the red end of the spectrum, and help give those circadian cues back to the astronauts. Next slide. All right, let's talk about a few of the other hazards of spaceflight. We've mentioned zero gravity in relation to the fluid shift. Haven't mentioned radiation, but that's a big deal. The extravehicular activities have unique risks related to pressure changes or decompression sickness. Within the spacecraft environment itself, remember, you've got to maintain a normal, healthy life support system there. So we have had issues of toxic atmospheres, alterations in gas concentrations. When I worked in the time where we sent astronauts to the Mir station, we had two very big events that were combustion events, one which resulted in a carbon monoxide exposure, another which was related to the oxygen generator that was burning uncontrollably. That was nearly catastrophic. Other things: isolation and confinement, noise, vibration, and the various recycling of waste, etc. So, a lot of hazards built into the spaceflight environment that people like us have to plan around and mitigate against, or sometimes treat for. Next slide. Carbon dioxide, you wouldn't think of that, because on Earth, with its concentration so low, we normally don't see any issues there. But it does have effects, and now just as we train astronauts in hypoxia, we train them also to recognize symptoms of carbon dioxide toxicity. So, you get your breathing rate doubles, you have some air hunger. Next slide. And here you can see the percent of carbon dioxide in the various places where you would experience the toxicity, from sweating to shortness of breath, tachycardia, and headache, confusion, etc. Next slide. And yeah, I already mentioned this. Issues with air hunger, also a factor in the diving community. Next slide. So CO2 then also is a vasodilator. So that has additive effects with what is already happening from our fluid shift. The fluid shift is causing some congestion in the vascular system in the cephalad regions. So this adds on to those symptoms. Next slide. And the thing that we've discovered is that astronauts reach a threshold of these sensitivities at a lower level, probably at a level that is about half of what you would see in terrestrial situations. Okay, next slide. And on the International Space Station, we've had events where CO2 gets up to 14 times normal, and you see the mission average peak, and the mission average is much higher than we'd see typically on the ground, and the symptom onset we've seen at a much lower level. Next slide. All right, kind of wrapping it up to again, you could have someone come and talk about an hour on vascular changes related to that, related to the fluid shift. We believe that we're seeing some things related to increased cerebral spinal fluid pressure. Next slide. Most recently, if you've been keeping up in the literature, we've had several reports from long-duration flyers who, during their flight or after the flight, have had significant reductions in their visual acuity. up to 1.5, 1.75 diopters. So there's a paper that is in press right now where they've done extensive evaluations on 6 of these astronauts where they found things like papilledema. They found cotton wool spots that weren't there before. They found choroidal folds that weren't there before. So that is probably what is the latest and greatest, most interesting topic in space medicine. Actually, I left NASA in 2004. This wasn't something that we had appreciated up to that point. When I left NASA, I think we had done about 7 or 8 of the International Space Station missions. So this has been a phenomena that has emerged since then. Next slide. So the bottom line for all of us dealing with airmen, soldiers, Marines, these things that would affect them, or that affect astronauts, should the warfighters of the future also be employed somehow via space, we're going to have to plan for these physiologic issues for them just like we do for astronauts today. Colonel Ortega, in his talk yesterday, showed a slide, I believe, where you might have a trans-space delivery vehicle to take special operations troops to the other side of the globe. Well, what do we know that they're going to get then? They're probably going to get the fluid shift issues. They're probably going to get hit with the space motion sickness issues. Next slide. And then, remember, it's not just going into zero gravity, but then you transit gravity again, coming back to Earth, and this will exacerbate those symptoms. Just like in the aviation environment, if you're familiar with the push-pull effect, I kind of liken it to this. So if that is in the offing for future warfighters, then you're going to have to plan for that as well. All right, I believe that was the last slide. I'll go ahead and push it one more time. Oh, and that's Dr. Schering over there, I believe, on the far left. And I hope that I've done him justice. Maybe as others were speaking yesterday and the day before, maybe next year he'll be invited back. He might go from lieutenant colonel to colonel if I've done a good job for him today. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take any questions.